to Sing a Song O, the story of Gilbert and Sullivan, written and presented by Michael McCaffery. Programme 4, Tragedy of Two Elderly Gentlemen.
The new opera, Princess Ida, premiered at the Savoy in January 1884 with dramas on both sides of the curtain. Rehearsals had been difficult and protracted, and for the first time, the partners seemed to be at odds about what they wanted. The situation was made worse by a return of Sullivan's kidney complaint, so severe that the later rehearsals took place without him. Gilbert was on edge throughout, and when Sullivan finally took to his bed, the whole thing seemed to spell disaster. Then, at the last minute, he turned up to conduct. He was injected with morphine to ease the pain and consumed pints of black coffee and brandy to keep himself conscious. When he walked into the pit, his first Savoy premiere as Sir Arthur Sullivan, the house went wild. Resolved to conduct the first performance of the new opera, managed to get up and dressed and drove to the theatre more dead than alive. Went into the orchestra at 8:10. Tremendous house, usual reception, very fine performance. Not a hitch. Brilliant success. After the performance, I turned faint and could not stand. Put to bed in dreadful pain. This time it was serious. Days and then weeks rolled by without any real improvement in his health. Even the Queen asked for news of him. As soon as he was well enough to travel, he embarked on a continental tour, taking in no doubt the usual selection of casinos and houses of pleasure, and following a timetable that would have exhausted a healthy man 20 years his junior. He had had the most awful fright, and although Princess Ida was being hailed as his best score to date, he used the journey to take stock of his position at the Savoy. Gilbert hadn't come out of Ida as well as his colleague. Critics objected to being offered old potatoes and pointed out that Gilbert was repeating himself. His inability to treat serious matters seriously was another cause for complaint, and he began to imagine that friends and enemies were laughing at him rather than with him. Increasingly prone to migraines and beginning to suffer from prolonged and debilitating attacks of gout, no joke as fellow sufferers can avow, Gilbert retreated into himself and crawled away to lick his wounds. After 7 continuous years of hard labour, Gilbert and Sullivan were suffering from burnout.
When you find you're a broken down critter who is all in a tremble and twitter, with your palate unpleasantly bitter, as if you'd just bitten a pill, when your legs are as thin as dividers, and you're plagued with unruly insiders, and your spine is all creaky with spiders, and you're highly gamboge in the gill. Creepy. Oh, creepy. When you've got a beehive in your head and a sewing machine in each ear, and you feel that you've eaten your bed, and you've got a bad headache down here. Oh. When such facts are about, and those symptoms you find in your body or crown, it's a shady lookout. You may make up your mind that you'd better lie down. Go at once and lie. smelly like tallow, and your tongue is decidedly yellow, with a pint of warm oil in your swallow, and a pound of tin tacks in your chest, and you're down in the mouth with the vapors, and all over your Morris wallpapers, black beetles are cutting their capers, and crawly things never at rest. Oh dear, crawly things, crawly things. When you doubt if your head is your own, and you jump when an open door slams, then you've got to a state which is known to the medical world as Jim Jams. If such symptoms you find in your body or head, they're not easy to quell. You may make up your mind you are better in bed, for you're not at all well. No, you're not at all well. Not at all well.
Princess Ida's initial success quickly waned. At first, Lent was blamed for slowing things down, but business didn't recover substantially after Easter, and when the summer brought the customary heatwave, it was clear that the show was all but over. Carte served the usual notice for a new opera, but this time he was in for a surprise. Sullivan wrote to him, "I will be quite frank. With Princess Ida, I have come to the end of my tether. My tunes are in danger of becoming mere repetitions. My concerted movements are getting to possess a strong family likeness, and I have rung all the changes possible in the way of variety of rhythm. It has hitherto been mere word-setting, and I have been continually keeping the music down so that none of the words will be lost. The music is never allowed to rise and speak for itself. Now, I should like to set a story of real human interest. Then there would be a fresh interest and a fresh vitality in our joint works." Gilbert reacted with characteristic fury, and a war of words ensued. Like it or not, they were contracted to Carte for a further 5 years, so Sullivan cleverly changed tack. He had no objections to writing with Gilbert, but he refused to compose anything he found unsuitable. Carte seems to have decided that the blame lay with Gilbert and put pressure on him to produce something that would satisfy Sullivan. Increasingly, Carte was to see Gilbert as the problem, and while relations with Sullivan were always close and personally warm, he was offhand with Gilbert. Growing more and more unhappy, Gilbert suggested several plots, all of which his partner rejected. Impasse loomed over the Savoy. Company gossip developed into public rumours, which spread like wildfire through the London clubs and into the papers. Gilbert and Sullivan were played out, finished. Carte was on the verge of bankruptcy. There would be no more new operas. The bubble had burst. What wasn't known was invented and offered with twice the force and conviction that attends mere fact. The begrudgers, of whom there were many, had a field day, and when it was announced that the next production at the Savoy was to be a revival of The Sorcerer, the detractors could rest happy that the most successful partnership in the history of theatre was over, and they need worry no more. The Sorcerer enjoyed a second triumphant premiere at the Savoy on October 1884, and decked out with a new production, new finales, and a magnificent new overture, it was to run for the rest of the winter. Having bought the necessary time, Gilbert was put to work again. His latest proposal was for a magic lozenge which, taken, would transform people into what they really are. The ugly become beautiful, the beautiful vain and emotionally crippled, the timid strong, and the strong unmasked as cowards. And Sullivan hated it. He pointed out that it was similar to endless Gilbert plots, and that they couldn't follow The Sorcerer with more or less the same idea. Moreover, it was mechanical and would offer him no chance to work on that idea of real human interest. Gilbert was sent packing, and as the winter wore on, he began to panic. The two most inventive minds in the history of English theatre couldn't come up with an idea between them. The whole thing was verging on farce.
With wily brain upon the spot of private plot, we'll plan the most ingenious private plots in private plots began. That's understood, so far we've got, and striking by the eye of spot. We'll now determine like a shot the details of his private plot.
I think we ought.
Such blush I never heard. Ah, happy thought.
I want to dash the bird. I'll tell you how.
Why don't put that in your head?
I got it now.
Don't take him away to bed, or put him to bed,
Or put him to bed. What would mean then?
Yes, certainly put him to bed.
But bless me, don't you see?
Do listen to me, I pray.
It certainly seems to me. Ah, this is the only way.
It's rubbish, absurd, you growl.
You talk ridiculous stuff. You're dribbling on and on.
You're a vapid and vain old mouth, you're a vain old mouth.
You're talking ridiculous
You're a
stuff.
vapid and vain old mouth, you're a vain old mouth. So far we have quite solved the plot, the plot, a very ingenious plot. But don't be unhappy, it's still on the tap, we will presently get to the capital plot.
Several ideas were floated, but Sullivan sent them all back. The nearest they got was a strange story set in Tudor England, which centred around a man who was about to be beheaded and saved himself by pretending that the execution had taken place. Sullivan found it all far too far-fetched, and Gilbert was at a loss for a solution, until his old friends, fashion and human gullibility, came to the rescue. Just as aestheticism had held the town to ransom in 1881, so the latest mania was for anything Japanese. In the high days of the British Empire, a taste for anything exotic was highly fashionable, and the great curiosity of the 1884 winter season was a trade fair in South Kensington, home sweet home for the aesthetic movement, and although it was dressed up as a cultural curiosity, it was little more than a marketplace. The enterprising organizer had translated an entire Japanese village to his showrooms, and the curious middle classes could wander round, imbibing the atmosphere of that most inscrutable of lands. There were shops, craftsmen, even geishas in a somewhat purified form, and for sixpence the visitor could partake of a genuine Japanese tea ceremony. Sushi hadn't been invented yet. More out of boredom than anything else, Gilbert went along. Kitten was very keen to see it. And his eyes were opened. Somewhere in the days following his visit, a new idea began to form in his mind. A Japanese opera that would glory in all the magnificent colour and spectacle and ritual that the exhibition had presented. He bought himself a Japanese sword and hung it on his study wall. A man of peace except in his professional affairs, Gilbert loved anything with a bloodthirsty connection. And the story goes that when the sword fell from the wall, the whole plot of the Mikado flashed into his mind. It may be true, but I prefer to think that the execution plot Sullivan had already rejected was nagging at Gilbert, and he saw possibilities and was determined to find a frame that would please his partner. And he'd found it. He'd struck gold.
The flowers that bloom in the spring, tra-la, we promise of merry sunshine. As we merrily dance and we sing, tra-la, we welcome the hope that they bring, tra-la, of a summer of roses and wine, of a summer of roses and wine. And that's what we mean when we say that a thing is welcome as flowers that bloom in the spring. Tra-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la, the flowers that bloom in the spring. Tra-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la. The flowers that bloom in the spring, tra-la, have nothing to do with the case. I've got to take under my wing, tra-la, a most unattractive old thing, tra-la, with a caricature of a face, with a caricature of a face. And that's what I mean when I say what I sing. spring. Oh, bother the flowers that bloom in the spring. Tra-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la. Oh, bother the flowers of spring. Tra-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la. Tra-la-la-la-la.
The Mikado was immediately the most successful opera that Gilbert and Sullivan were to invent. Coming at exactly the right time, it struck a chord in its audience which still sounds today whenever it's played. It's simply the most exuberant, infectious, exhilarating, and implausible work in the series. It's also the most dubious, to the point that some commentators have found it downright immoral. So it has everything.
Were you not too cocoa-plighted, I would say in tender tone, loved one, let us be united, let us be each other's own. I would merge all rank and station, worldly sneers are naught to us, and to mark my admiration, I would kiss you fondly thus. I would kiss you fondly thus.
But as I'm engaged to Coco, to embrace you thus con poco, would distinctly be no joke, and for yam I should get Toco.
Toco,
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 Toco. So in spite of all temptation, such a theme I'll not discuss, and on no consideration will I kiss you only thus. Will I kiss you fondly thus? Let me make it clear to you, this is what I'll never do. This, oh this, oh this, oh this, this is what I never do. This, oh this, oh this, oh this, this is what I never do. I never do. Oh this, this is what I'll never do.
Gilbert and Cart spared no expense to make the Mikado the most lavish spectacle ever seen in London. Costumes were imported from Japan for the principals, and the chorus was made up in the most expensive silks and satins available. The two sets were regarded as some of the most exotic and wonderful creations ever seen, and Sullivan's endlessly inventive score was immaculately choreographed and staged by Gilbert. The author went to enormous pains to get every single detail of Japanese custom and behaviour accurate to the last gesture, and yet the Mikado is English to its fingertips. Gilbert had done it again, taking two subjects, the craze for the pure, remote and esoteric world of Japan, and the self-serving, valueless and hypocritical English middle classes who were snapping up treasures they barely understood. He created one of the best farces in the language and one of the most brittle satires that was to emerge from the 19th century. Without exception, every character in the Mikado is deplorable, and yet each of them has a public persona which allows them to appear charming, compassionate and altruistic, and Sullivan matches him at every move.
Here's how you do, if I marry you. When your time has come to perish, then the maiden whom you cherish must be slaughtered too. Here's how you do, here's how you do.
Here's a pretty mess, in a month or less. I must die without a wedding, let the bitter tears I'm shedding witness my distress. Here's a pretty mess, here's a pretty mess.
Here's a state of things, to her life she clings. Matrimonial devotion doesn't seem to suit her notion, barrier it brings. Here's a state of things, here's a state of things.
With no passion that's intense, we worship and adore. But the laws of common sense we oughtn't to ignore. If what was said is true, 'tis death to marry you. Here's a pretty state of things, here's a pretty how you do. Here's a pretty state of things, a pretty state of things.
Here's a how you do.
Here's a howdy, here's a howdy do. Or if what I say is true, I cannot marry you. Here's a pretty, pretty state of things. Here's a pretty how you do.
Even the beautiful Yum Yum, beloved both of Coco and Nanki Poo, is a gold digger at heart. Whatever else happens, she knows she'll survive. And the poison is even more effective because Sullivan clothes it in his most perfect soprano aria. Any one of 100 composers would have tackled it and done the predictable thing. But something tapped a vein in Sullivan, and he came up with a song that really no one could have done better.
The sun whose rays are all ablaze with ever-living glory does not deny his majesty, he scorns to tell a story. He don't exclaim, I blush for shame, so kindly indulgent. But fierce and bold in fiery gold, he glories all effulgent. I mean to rule the earth as he the sky. We really know the sun and I mean to rule the earth as he the sky. We really know the sun and I. Observe his flame, that placid dame, the moon's celestial highness. There's not a trace upon her face of diffidence or shyness. She borrows life and through the night, and kindly all acclaim her. And truth to tell, she lights up well, so I for one don't blame her. Pray make no mistake, we are not shy. We're very wide awake, the one and all. Pray make no mistake, we are not shy. We're very wide awake, the moon and
The Mikado still excites an audience, unlike any other operetta in the language. It's seldom placed to less than full houses anywhere. It's been translated into more than 40 languages, and it made Gilbert and Sullivan immensely, almost ridiculously wealthy. And yet, both of them were chary of it. Sullivan was mortally offended when it was described as his masterpiece, and Gilbert, well, where did he put it? Realistically, he saw it as his fortune and his pension combined. But I suspect that he was uncomfortable about it. Instead of being another success, it was the success, the one that everything else would be measured against.
Oh, he's gone and married Yum Yum. Your anger may bury, for all may be merry. I think you had better succumb and join our expressions of glee.
On this subject I pray you be dumb. Your notions, though many, are not worth a penny. The one for your guidance is mum. You've got a good bargain in me.
On this subject we pray you be dumb. We think you had better succumb. To murder, a penny for murder, a penny for murder, a penny.
By the end of the year, the Mikado was playing all over Europe. Only Paris turned its nose up at it, and all over America too. Carte at one point had 5 touring companies working Great Britain, and the usual selection of waltzes, lancers and quadrilles were churned out. There were Mikado cutouts, Mikado silks and Mikado chocolates. Irish audiences can still enjoy a Mikado biscuit when they want one. It was, quite simply, a phenomenon. Sullivan went off on holiday, as did Gilbert, while Carte set about building a magnificent hotel, the Savoy, which, like the theatre, would be the finest in the land. And all was right as right could be. Sullivan's holidays were stolen out of other affairs, however, and instead of capitalising on the time the Mikado bought him, he squandered it, so that in the autumn of 1886 he was behind with everything. Carte wanted a new opera, and there was another serious project on the go, a dramatic cantata, The Golden Legend, which would bring him one step closer to the long-awaited Grand Opera. The Golden Legend was to become the most performed choral work in England for the next 30 years, until Elgar's Gerontius replaced it. It's since faded into oblivion, but that has more to do with fashion than any intrinsic failure. At its premiere, it was hailed as a masterpiece. When the cantata was repeated in London at Queen Victoria's command, she received the composer afterwards. She expressed her pleasure at having heard the work. "At last I have heard the Golden Legend," she said. "You really should write a grand opera, Sir Arthur. You would do it so well." Sullivan, the serious, was back in business. But the rehabilitation was short-lived. The playboy side of his character reasserted itself, and he was soon back at home, gambling, partying, racing, and putting in the odd appearance at the Savoy, where a new opera, Ruddigore, was already in rehearsal. Gilbert loved the theatre, and it was to the old-fashioned world of penny plain and twopence coloured that he returned for his new opera. Melodrama of the hiss and boo variety had been popular in England for all of the 19th century, and although its fortunes had waned recently, Gilbert saw it as a possible vehicle for a satire on the theatre of his youth. This was a sprat to catch mackerels, because the real target in Ruddigore isn't the theatre, but the double standards of Victorian life. The perfect expression of topsy-turvydom, Ruddigore hangs on one basic idea: it doesn't matter what you do, it's what people think you do that counts, and a man can get up to all sorts of mischief, provided it's done in the interests of society at large. Gilbert peopled his new opera with every conceivable theatrical stereotype: the blameless hero, the virtuous heroine, the jolly Jack Tar, and the wicked roue, the innocent maiden who is seduced by him and goes mad with shame, the faithful old retainer, and the commonsensical old dame. Throw in a chorus of bucks and blades, all mad, says Mad Margaret, because they sing choruses in public, a troupe of professional bridesmaids, and a whole gallery of pictures that come to life at night, and you've nothing more or less than a 19th century Rocky Horror Show.
When the night wind howls in the chimney cowls, and the beds in the moonlight climbs, and inky clouds like funeral shrouds sail over the midnight skies. When the footpads wail and the night birds wail, and black dogs bay at the moon, then is the spectre's holiday, then is the ghost I knew. Oh, then is the ghost I
Roddigor is simply the most sophisticated work that Gilbert and Sullivan ever came up with, but the audience was bewildered. Was it a serious piece done badly, or a comic piece done brilliantly? Gilbert was ahead of his time throughout his career, but this time the Philistines realised that they were the butt of the joke, and they reacted in no uncertain terms. They'd just had their first flop, and as far as Gilbert was concerned, it was all Sullivan's fault.
My own impression is that the first act led everyone to believe that the piece was going to be bright and cheery throughout, and that the audience were not prepared for the ghost music. Music that is very fine indeed, but out of place in a comic opera. It is as though one inserted 50 lines of Paradise Lost into a farcical comedy.
Roddigor just didn't work at the time. Various reasons suggest themselves. Gilbert worked unchecked, Sullivan was overcommitted, and Cart was overextending himself. And then the success of the Mikado had encouraged them all to regard Princess Ida as a one-off near miss. The real problems came up in rehearsal, and Cart should have tackled them. Instead of mediating, he left the partners to battle it out amongst themselves, and Gilbert lost. His play had been sacrificed at a crucial point to Sullivan's vanity. But there was more to it than that. If the ghost scene had been the only problem, it might have been fixed. Gilbert and Sullivan did a lot of fixing after that awful first night. But author and composer had been at odds about the real thrust of the piece all along, and the opera was finally premiered in a form that didn't reflect the intentions of either of them. The ingredients are all there, and if they'd only followed the plotted course, Roddigor would have been as great a success as the Mikado. Moreover, it might have been a fascinating and important development in English opera.
My eyes are fully open to my awful situation. I should go at once to Roderick and make him an oration. I should tell him I've recovered my forgotten moral senses, and don't get up and say me for any consequences. Now I do not want to perish by the sword or by the dagger, but a martyr may indulge a little pardonable swagger, and a word or two of compliment my vanity will flatter. But I've got to die tomorrow, so it really doesn't matter.
So it really doesn't matter.
So it really doesn't matter. So it really doesn't matter. So it really doesn't matter.
So it really doesn't matter.
So it really doesn't matter.
So it really doesn't matter. If I were not a little mad and generally silly, I should give you my advice upon the subject willy-nilly. I should show you in a moment how to grapple with the question, and you'd really be astonished at the force of my suggestion on the subject. I should write you a most valuable letter full of excellent suggestions when I feel a little better, but at present I'm afraid I am as mad as any hatter, so I keep them to myself, for my opinion doesn't matter.
Her opinion doesn't matter.
Her opinion doesn't matter.
Her opinion doesn't matter.
Her opinion doesn't matter.
My opinion doesn't matter.
Her opinion doesn't matter.
My opinion doesn't matter.
Why am I so lucky as to have a steady brother who could talk to me as we are talking now to one another, who could give me good advice when he discovered I was erring, which is just the very favour which in you I am conferring. My existence would have made a rather interesting idyll, and I might have lived and died a very decent little riddle. This particularly rapid, unintelligible patter isn't generally heard, and if it is, it doesn't matter.
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 This particularly rapid, unintelligible patter isn't generally heard, and if it is, it doesn't matter. This particularly rapid, unintelligible patter isn't generally heard, and if it is, it doesn't matter.
One thing was abundantly clear now. The two minds no longer thought as one, and as soon as they could, both pursued other interests. Shakespeare beckoned to Sullivan in the form of his deputy on earth, Sir Henry Irving, who was mounting a lavish production of Macbeth with the glorious Ellen Terry as his not very fiend-like queen. Sullivan had longed to work with the great man, but there was to be no real collaboration. Irving's business manager, one Bram Stoker, told the composer what was required, and that was that. Nevertheless, Sullivan was able to record in his diary his schoolboy-like glee at reading a playbill which ran, words by Shakespeare, production by Irving, music by Sullivan. According to his lights, he'd arrived. Again. Cart was no doubt delighted to see his friend in such distinguished company, but it didn't stop him from demanding another opera, and this time Sullivan insisted on having a say in it. The Yeoman of the Guard was to be a departure for the team in every sense. Not only a new departure, but something unique in English music. Its origins lie in several Gilbert works, not the least of which is perhaps that abandoned Tudor comedy, which was transformed into The Mikado. The author read the work to Sullivan and Cart on Christmas Day 1887. Christmas Day always seems to have been auspicious for the team, and the composer was pleased. Immensely pleased. Pretty story, no topsy-turvydom, very human, and very funny also. The idea for the new opera, called at this stage The Tower of London, is reputed to have come from a poster showing a beefeater. Now, no doubt the poster set Gilbert thinking, just as the Japanese exhibition had done 3 years earlier, but its real roots lie elsewhere, in Gilbert's love of the romantic, the historical, his own imagined Elizabethan ancestors, his strongly developed sense of the cruelty of human beings, and a mania then possessing the British, at once as pronounced and considerably more dangerous than the taste for aestheticism or the exotic that had informed Patience or the Mikado. And the name of this new mania was patriotism, dressed up this time as what we now call heritage. Victoria had been queen for 50 years, but the crown was in deep trouble, and at times the whole British system seemed under threat. The idea of a British Republic was seriously and openly discussed, and so the government leapt at the chance of staging a golden jubilee to prop up the ailing firm. Street parties, commemorative statues, jubilee halls, and flag-waving in general beset the nation in a series of highly organised public relations exercises. But Gilbert was attracted by the theatricality of the presentation. It was colourful and stirring, but there was no mention of the cruelty, bloodshed, and political intrigue that had gone into making Britain great. More intrigued by the paradox, I think, than any sense of injustice, Gilbert set about weaving that motif into the plot for his new opera. The Yeoman of the Guard is set in the 16th century, in the Tower of London, a grim, half-forgotten fortress on the edge of the city. Part garrison, part gulag, the Tower is a political prison in which those who refuse to conform to the latest orthodoxies rot while waiting for their execution. And in this opera, the Tower has a genuine character. To the older generation, it stands for duty and conscience and obedience. To the young, it means cruelty, oppression, control, and inhumanity. Increasingly, it comes to represent a danger to those who try to fight against its blind tyranny, and as the opera progresses, all the characters find themselves imprisoned by it and its values, saving, paradoxically, the one man who was under sentence of death at the beginning.
My lord, I know not how to tell the news I heard. I and my comrades sought the prisoner's cell. His was there. His was there. His was there. Assessed upon the prisoner, we sought his cell in duty, but the double ratings on the word of prisoner at all we found 300 high, 300 near. The man we saw with anxious care had vanished into empty air. The man we saw with anxious care had vanished into empty air.
all I knew of his escape, nutritious left enchantment must have been at work. What I done, oh, woe is me, indeed I can't invent it, why would he is free?
Oh, woe is you, your angry sick. Oh, woe is me, I'd rather think. Oh, woe is me, I'd rather think. Yes, woe is me, I'd rather think. But every tide you are his bride, and I am left alone, me wretch. Woe is me, I'd rather think. Yes, woe is me, I'd rather think. Yes, woe is me, yes, woe is me.
Hardly your typical Gilbert and Sullivan. The characters, too, are untypical, and all the more surprising since, with one exception, they were played by exactly the same troupe who'd played at the Savoy since it opened. Musically and dramatically, the writers demand more of the performers here than in any other opera. The type or lines of business remain the same, but each is given an extra dimension, a genuinely human aspect which keeps the action consistently in development throughout the evening. Even the forced marriages which take up the last 10 minutes of the plot, as usual, have an added bittersweet twist. We've seen young Phoebe Merrill genuinely in love with one man, noble, kind, handsome, when fate decrees that she must marry his mirror opposite, the man she's been trying to escape all of her life. We can hardly see the consequences as comic. Similarly, when Dame Carruthers succeeds in trapping old Merrill, she does so in the awareness that he only marries her to save his neck from the block. It's Coco and Katisha again, but this time neither of them are laughing. Gilbert presents their courtship as ghastly rapture, and Sullivan gives them, to all intents and purposes, a music hall song for their wedding march.
Rapture, rapture, when the votary flushed with capture seeks the notary. Joy and jollity, the head is polity, reigns frivolity. Rapture, rapture, joy and jollity, the head is polity, reigns frivolity. Rapture, rapture.
Doleful, doleful, when humanity with its soulful obscenity, contemplativity, down declivity, sees captivity. Doleful, doleful, contemplativity, down declivity, sees captivity. Doleful, doleful.
Joyful, joyful, when virginity seems so coyful man's affinity. Fatal flowery, bright and bowery is a dowery. Joyful, joyful, fatal flowery, bright and bowery is a dowery. Joyful, joyful.
Ghastly, ghastly, when men sorrowful, thirsty, lastly, ophthalmological. After Nanny, heels to Annie, he goes and Nanny. Ghastly, ghastly.
Joyful, joyful.
Ghastly, ghastly.
Joyful, joyful.
Ghastly, 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 ghastly.
Rapture, rapture, when the votary flushed with capture seeks the notary. Joy and jollity, and equality, reigns frivolity. Rapture, rapture, joy and jollity, and equality, reigns frivolity. Rapture, rapture.
Doleful, doleful.
Rapture, rapture.
Doleful, doleful.
Rapture,
A dark work, then, overcast by death, anxiety, compromise in the face of the inevitable. But a tragedy? Well, I don't think so. And if it is, then it is so in the way that so many of the greatest comedies are tragic. Tragic like Figaro or Così, like Chekhov's comedies and Shaw's great middle plays, in which dreams of happiness ultimately come face to face with cold reality, and hope is never again to be weighed against anything other than the chance of disappointment. The tragic tag, of course, comes largely from the tradition of having the jester, Jack Point, die at the end of the opera, as though a death immediately makes a play tragic, which of course it doesn't. Gilbert's final stage direction is that Point falls insensible at their feet, and this was how he chose to leave it. Within months of the Savoy premiere, provincial performers were already playing the finale as a death scene, and Gilbert's supposed to have consented. But he had endless opportunities to change that stage direction, and he never did. My own feeling is that he liked the ambiguity and enjoyed the frisson of the wholly unexpected at the end of what was a very unusual Savoy opera. And he was far too clever to give the critics a definite signal by which they might choose to judge him one way or the other.
Strange adventure, maiden wedded to a groom she'd never seen. Never seen. Groom about to be beheaded in an on Tower Green. Tower Green. Groom in dreary dungeon lying. Groom.
The critical judgment was more than positive. Gilbert, of course, was rebuked for certain suggested borrowings from earlier operas. Maritana was cited as inspiring the L.C. Fairfax plot. But the work as a whole was considered so original a departure that it was acclaimed in every quarter. The Daily Telegraph even went so far as to suggest that this was the beginning of a whole renaissance in serious English opera, and Sullivan was urged to get to work on the grand opera Queen Victoria had suggested. Gilbert's feelings were perhaps less simple. He had certainly given his composer what was wanted, but at what cost? The comic element remains strong in The Yeoman of the Guard, but the emphasis has moved away from the absurdity of the Mikado or Iolanthe. Sullivan has been given his real human interest, but at what cost to their partnership? Only time would tell.
It is sung to the moon by a lovelorn loon who fled from the mocking throng. Oh, it's the song of a merry man moping mum, whose soul was sad and whose glance was glum, who sipped no sup and who craved no crumb, as he sighed for the love of a lady.
Hey,
story of Gilbert and Sullivan was written and presented by Michael McCaffery. And tomorrow morning at 11:30, Programme 5, the final programme, As Far as Time Can Reach.